Good morning, viewers. Welcome to KUTV. This is Elibo Live. And as your timetable suggests or indicates, we are having science class 8. So welcome all on board. Make sure you have your writing materials so that you can be able to take some notes that are very necessary. We are going to talk about plants in class 8, and as how I like to do it, we are going to review our previous classes on the same topic, plants. So we have our topic, plants. My name is Teacher Steplaton. So we have plants, and I'll start by the review of the previous classes, which I'll start from class 1, also called grade 1. So at this level, we are looking at plants found in our locality. According to where you stay, there are plants that are found there. So that's what is learned at that part. We also have parts of a plant, and parts of a plant, we have the flowers, which are usually on the upper part. We have the leaves. So we have the stem. We have the branches that connect to the stem, and we have the roots down there. So those are parts of a plant. We also have the edible parts of a plant. When we say edible, we mean something that can be eaten. So the edible parts of a plant can be the fruit. Even the leaves are also edible. That is what is expected of you in that level. In grade 2, we look at planting seeds. In grade 2, we look at planting seeds. Under planting seeds, you were expected to plant different seeds, of which you did that time. Then we also have caring for plants. And caring for plants, this entails two main things. So we have weeding and we have watering of the plants. When you talk about weeding, we are talking about removal of unwanted plant materials. When you talk about watering plants, in the common language, that is irrigation. We also have, in the same grade, we have classification of leaves, and leaves in class 2 can be classified into two ways. It can be classified according to color. Now, according to color, we can have green leaves and non-green leaves. We can have size, we can have shape, and we can also have texture. Remember, texture is how smooth or rough a substance is. Then we come to grade 3 in the same topic. At this part, we look at uses of plants. And uses of plants, we have several uses of plants. Some of the uses of plants are, we can use plants for food. We can use plants as food. So many plants are used as food. So we can have food as one of our use for plants. We can have clothing. Plants can be used to give us clothes or to make clothes. So we can have basketry. Basketry is another use of the plants. We can have other uses as furniture. We can also have medicine. We can also have beauty. Now, when you talk about food, different plants, most of the plants are used as foods. We can have maize, we can have beans, peas, wheat. Those are examples of plants that give us food. When you come to clothing, we remember cotton. Cotton can be processed and we can be able to get clothing from there. We have paper. We get paper from plants. Basketry, plants that have reeds give us baskets. Furniture, when you talk about furniture, we are talking about pine. Pine can be used to give us furniture. Mahogany is another example of a plant. Plants can also be used to give us tea, to give us coffee, also medicine. We talk about medicine, you look at plants like aloe vera, they can be used to extract medicine from them. We also have beauty. Plants can be used for beautification. Look at flowers. Take, for example, a rose flower. An area where flowers are planted looks so beautiful. Those are some of the uses of plants. And that is grade 3 work. Now we come to class 4, what you learn about class 4. And at this point, you have to pay much attention because several questions in exams come from this part. Now, in class 4 plants, we classify plants, and classification is placing things according to similarities and differences. So in class 4 plants, we classify plants according to cash crops and food crops. As the word suggests, cash and food. So cash crops, these are plants that are used to give us cash. In which way? They are grown. After they are grown, they are sold. Then we get the cash. So that those are cash crops. Then we also have food crops. These are crops that are grown, and then we can be able to use them as food at home. So that is the broad classification of plants, which we have cash crop and food crop. So if we go down to cash crop, we also have classification of cash crops. So we have 3 classifications of cash crops, and we also have classifications of food crops. We have 5 classifications of food crops. So when you talk about cash crops, we are talking about beverage crops, we are talking about fiber, and we are talking about oil crops. When you talk about food crops, we are talking about cereals, we are talking about legumes, we are talking about fruits, we are talking about vegetables, we are talking about tubers also. We're talking about tubers. So when you look at cash crops, we have beverage crops. Beverage crops, these are crops that when processed, they give us drinks. So that is the first classification of cash crops. We have beverage crops. These are crops that when they are processed, they can be able to give us drinks. Now when we talk about beverage crops, you're talking about tea is an example. We have coffee and we have cocoa. So these are cash crops under the category of beverage. Then we can also look at fiber. That is another classification of cash crops. Now, fiber crops, these are crops that produce thread. They have a thread-like material in them. When I talk about fiber crops, I'm talking about sisal. Sisal is an example of a fiber. I'm talking about cotton is another example, and I'm also talking about flax. We also have oil crops, and oil crops, these are types of crops that give us oil. So we can extract oil crops from them. So let's look at examples of the cash crops. So the first example or the first classification is beverage. Under beverage, we have tea. Under beverage, you have tea. So we have tea as the first example. We have coffee. We have cocoa. These are examples of beverage crops. We also have fiber crops. Fiber crops, these are crops, I've said, they have thread-like substance in them. So when I talk about fiber crops, I'm talking about sisal. I'm talking about cotton. I'm talking about flax. So those are examples of oil crops that we have. Those are examples of fiber crops that you have, sorry. So we also have oil crops. We also have oil crops. So examples of oil crops, we can have coconut. We can have simsim, gives us oil. We can have corn, is another example of an oil crop. We also have groundnuts. So those are some of the examples of cash crops and their examples. So I'll repeat very fast. Cash crops, we have beverage, we have oil crops, and we have fiber. And I've given an example in each of them. So I'm also going to talk about food crops. And as I earlier explained, food crops are crops which are grown and are used at home. So we have classifications of food crops, which are cereals, which are also legumes, which are fruits, which are vegetables, and which are also tubers. So examples of cereal crops that we can look at. Here we have maize. We have maize as an example. Cereal crops, we have maize. We have wheat. We have rice. And other examples also, which can include oat, barley, and also sorghum. Those are examples of cereal crops. When you come to legumes, examples of legumes, I'll be writing 2 examples in each because of the space, and I'll just say out the others. So examples of legumes, we have beans, we have peas, we also have groundnuts. Those are examples of legumes. We have examples of fruits. There are so many examples of fruits. You can help me give some examples of fruits while you're at home there. You can help me give some of examples of fruits. You can start with the ones you love. For my sake, I love an apple, so I'll give an example of an apple as a fruit. We also have banana. We also have mango. Those are examples of fruits. We have vegetables also. Vegetables at home, you can also help me give examples of vegetable crops. Vegetables, you can start with your favorite. You can start with your favorite. So my favorite vegetable, I can give spinach. Spinach is an example of a vegetable. So apart from spinach, you can also give other examples of vegetables at home. Sukuma wiki, also called kales. We also have tubers. Now when we come to tubers, tubers are classified into 2. So we have root tubers and we have stem tuber. Now we first of all explain what a tuber is. A tuber is a swelling. So plants that store their food in the roots will be called root tubers, which means their root has a swelling. Plants that store their food on the stem will be called stem tubers, which means their stems have a swelling. Now examples of root tubers, we can have examples of root tubers. We can have sweet potato, we can have carrot, we can have cassavas, we can have arrowroots, we can have turnips, we can also have radishes as examples of root tubers, which means these plants have a swelling. We also have stem tubers, and examples of stem tubers, we can have yams, we can also have ginger and Irish potato. Now, I want you to be very keen and notice the following differences when it comes to tubers. The first difference that I want you to get is the difference between a sweet potato and an Irish potato. A sweet potato is a root tuber, while an Irish potato is a stem tuber. That is the first. Then I also want you to be keen on yams, arrowroots. So arrowroots are examples of root tubers, but yams are examples of stem tubers. Now there's also something that is key here, and most examiners like to bring it, which is sugarcane. Sugarcane stores its food in the stems, but it is not a stem tuber. Why is it not called a stem tuber and it stores its food in the stems? I started by saying a tuber is a swelling. So for that reason, the sugarcane cannot qualify to be called a stem tuber, but it stores its food in the stems. So you need to be aware of those differences. So we have our table there, which have the plants, the cash crops with the examples, the food crops with the examples. In this same level, we also talk about weeds. And a weed is unwanted plant. A weed is unwanted plant, so a plant that grows where it's not needed. And we have examples of weeds. We can have a sodomepo as an example. We can have a blackjack, a thonepo. Thonepo is also called datura. We have wandering Jew. We have oxalis. We have Mexican marigold. And we also have pigweed. So these are examples of weeds, and they are right there. So there are several questions that you can be asked on weeds. So if we start with the sodom apple, so this sodom apple, it usually have green fruits when raw and yellow when ripe. So when you're asked which weed has fruits that are green when raw and yellow when ripe, remember to talk about a sodom apple. We look at a blackjack. Blackjack has hooks that enable it to stick on the body of an animal. While the animal is moving, can carry the blackjack from one point to another, and that is also called seed dispersal. We also have a thorn apple. Thorn apple, I've told you the other name of a thorn apple is datura. So it's also called datura. What you need to know about this is highly poisonous. So this one, when taken, it can cause serious food poisoning. So datura is highly poisonous. We also have wandering Jew. From your English, wandering means to roam carelessly. So from the word wandering, we get wandering Jew. So wandering Jew, this is a type of weed that grows along the ground. So it grows along the ground. So when you're asked which weed grows along the ground, you should remember that is a wandering Jew. We have oxalis. This is an edible weed. We have oxalis, which is an edible weed. Mexican marigold. Mexican marigold is a weed that produces a smell. So Mexican marigold is a weed that produces a smell. You are likely to be asked by an examiner this question. In science, questions do not come directly. Sometimes you have to apply. So you'll be told, a farmer noticed that after milking his cow, the milk had unusual smell. Which one of the following weeds is likely to have been consumed by the animal? So the right answer is supposed to be Mexican marigold, because it makes or it produces a smell. Therefore, when taken by an animal like a cow, the milk will also have a smell. Then we also have pigweed as our other example of a weed. So we have a pigweed. Now when you talk about a pigweed, you need to know that a pigweed is edible. So it's an edible weed, which means it is eaten. When we talk about edible, we mean that it is eaten. So those are examples of weeds that are taught in class 4, and we have ways of getting rid of these weeds. That is called weeding. So we can uproot, we can dig them out, and the best way is digging them out. When you're asked the best way to control weeds, that is digging them out. When it is specific, the best way to control weeds in a very small farm, such as a garden, then it is uprooting. But the best way now to control weeds in a large plantation, then that is use of chemicals. So those are examples of weeds and how we control the weeds. We go to class 5, we talk about plants. Here we also have classification, and as I told you, classification is grouping things together based on their characteristics. So those with the same characteristics are put together. In class 5, we'll look at plants, and we look at classification of plants due to the presence of what you call chlorophyll. Due to the presence of what you call chlorophyll. So this is what I'm calling chlorophyll. This is the spelling of chlorophyll. So plants here are classified due to the presence of this substance we call chlorophyll. Now, what is chlorophyll? Chlorophyll is the green coloring matter. So plants are categorized according to the presence of chlorophyll, where we get green plants and non-green plants. So we have green plants as one category and non-green plants as another category. Under green plants, it is further classified according to how the plant reproduces. So reproduction is actually giving rise to new offsprings. So we have plants that reproduce through flowers, and we have plants that do not produce through flowers, which means they produce through other means. These other means can be spores formation, can be budding, and can also be cell division. So plants that produce through production of flowers, we call them flowering plants, and plants that produce through other means, we call non-flowering plants. So examples of flowering plants, we can have monocots and dicots. So those are examples of flowering plants. Then we can give examples of monocots, and you can give examples of dicots. So that's the classification. So you can look at this table. So we have plants which are classified according to the presence of chlorophyll, which we get green plants. So these are green plants, which means they have chlorophyll, and these are non-green plants, which means they don't have chlorophyll. Then green plants can further be divided into flowering plants. This produced by means of flowers, and non-flowering plants, which means they produce through other means. So we also have monocots. Monocots are plants that have one cotyledon, and we can have one example, which is a maize. We also have dicots. Dicots are plants which have two cotyledons, and we can have an example as a bean. Then we have non-flowering plants. Non-flowering plants can be categorized into conifers. That is a first group of non-flowering plants. When I talk about conifers, I'm talking about pine, I'm talking about cypress, I'm talking about cedar, and we also have the last one called Douglas fir. Some books just call it fir. So those are examples of conifers, and conifers are green and flowering plants. Apart from conifers, we have other examples which will include algae. Some people will call it alga. I like to call it algae. We have liverwort, we have ferns, we also have moss. So these are examples of green and flowering plants. Then we also have green and flowering plants. And I started with the first example, and this bracket tree as an example of a non-green plant is used by most examiner as a distractor. Most candidates, because of the word tree, they tend to assume it is a green plant. It is not. So it is an example of a non-green plant, bracket tree. Then we also have fungi. When I talk about fungi, fungi is a huge group. Fungi is a huge group that can include mushroom. Mushroom is an example of a fungi. It can include mucor. It can include puffball. It can also include others, which can be penicillium, can be toadstools, can be ringworms, can be yeast, mildew, mold. So those are examples of fungi, and fungi are non-green plants. Now these non-green plants, we have some that are useful and some that are not useful. Examples of useful non-green plants, we have mushroom. Mushroom can be used as food. If you have gone to a good hotel, when I talk about a good hotel, I don't mean a kibanda somewhere. I mean a good hotel where you go, you sit and order food, then it is cooked, then you served. So if you go to such hotels, you will get mushroom as one of the appetizers, as a mushroom soup, so it's used as food. We have penicillin, which can be used as medicine. We have yeast, which can be used in cooking or making dough for things like mandazi. If you go to buy a mandazi, and then we have two, a big one and a small one, which one will you go for? I'm sure you'll go for the big one. That is due to the presence of that yeast. So it's able to make that food to appear that big. So those are examples of non-green plants that we have. And we also look at something else at this level, which are external parts of a plant. And examples of external parts of a plant, we have the roots, we have the stems, we have the leaves, we have the fruits, we have the flowers. Because it is a revision of this topic, I'll be very specific on specific parts that exams usually comes. So I'll start with the roots. We have different functions of the roots. One of the main functions performed by all the roots is anchorage. Anchorage is support. Now you're likely to be given an example or a practical example, and then you're told pupils from a specific school put a seedling in colored water or ink, and then they observed. Now when they cut the stem, they saw the blue color. If it was blue ink, they saw the blue color. What were they likely to be investigating? Or they cut both the stem and the leaves. What were they likely to be investigating? Now when the stem is cut alone, we are looking at absorption of water and mineral salts. And absorption of water and mineral salts is done by the roots. When the stem and the leaves are cut, now we are not looking at absorption, we are looking at transportation. So please get the difference between the two. So we have absorption and we have transportation. So parts of the plant, so we have the roots, which is used for absorption of water and mineral salts. So, and the main function of roots is anchorage or support. You're likely to be asked which function is performed by all roots, that is support. Now stem, I've said when the stem is cut, then remember that that person is looking for absorption to check if roots absorb water. So it's looking for absorption. We have leaves. When the leaves are cut, then both the leaves and the stem, then that is transportation. Transportation. We also have fruits as an example of external parts of a flower, and examples of external parts of a plant. And we also have flowers as also another example. Before I leave external parts of a plant, I want to give a practical experiment that is usually set, and that is on photosynthesis and transpiration. What is photosynthesis? You can answer there at home. You can tell whoever you're watching with what is photosynthesis. Then they will correct you later after I've given the correct definition. So we have photosynthesis and respiration, photosynthesis and transpiration. So photosynthesis is the process through which green plants make their own food, and transpiration is the process through which plants lose excess water. Now, plants, when we are checking at transpiration, we tie the leaves with a colorless polythene, and then we see droplets of water. Photosynthesis, we tie with a black polythene, and then the leaves will turn yellow in color. So when we tie with the black polythene is photosynthesis. When we tie with the colorless paper, that is transpiration. And that is about the class 5. There are so many questions set there, that's why I was very slow. We also go to class 6, which we talk about reproduction in plants. And reproduction in plants, we are looking at a flower. So how do you define a flower? A flower is the reproductive part of a plant. And parts of the plant, of the flower are there. So we have the petals, the anthers, filament, ovary, sepals, style, and stigma. So I will mention them depending on their categories. We can have stamen, Stamen are the male parts of a flower. The male parts of the flower here are anthers and filament. You can look at them in the diagram. Then we also have the female parts of a flower, which are called pistil or also carpels. And examples of pistils or carpel, we have stigma, we have style, we have ovary, we have ovules. Those are examples of pistils. We also have collective name for petals. So when petals are put together collectively, we call that corolla, not Toyota Corolla car, but Corolla collective name. When sepals are put together, they also called calyx. So those are key things to note. Then here we also look at pollination, and we look at types of pollination. So pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma. Types of pollination, we have two types of pollination. The two types of pollination here are self-pollination and cross-pollination. I'll be very simple for you to get the difference between the two. In self-pollination, we have the same plant. So the flowers are pollinating on the same plant. In cross-pollination, we have different plants. So that is the simplest way you can get the difference between self-pollination and cross-pollination. So when we have the same plant, that is self-pollination. When we have different plants, that is cross-pollination. So you can be given a diagram in exam, so you should be able to notice that. We don't look at the flower, we look at the plant. I hope you have gotten that back at home. We go to the next part of this class 6 work, and we look at agents of pollination. So when we look at agents of pollination, we look at insect-pollinated flowers and wind-pollinated flowers. And I'll teach both because one is the opposite of the other. So insect-pollinated flowers are large in size, wind will be small. Insects are brightly colored, wind are dull colored. Insects have sticky pollen grains, wind have a large amount of pollen grains. Insects have a flat stigma, they have a nectar, and they have a sweet scent. The wind-pollinated flowers, the anthers and the stigma hang outside, and they have no nectar and they have no scent. Now these characteristics enable the flower to be pollinated. Let's look at insect-pollinated flower. It should be large in size to allow the insect to get inside. A good examiner will not ask you which flowers are large in size. Will ask you, as a class 8 boy was walking home, he noticed flowers that have large petals. Why do you think they had large petals? The answer is to allow the insect to get inside. We also have bright colors to attract the insects, sticky pollen to stick on the body of the insect, and flat stigma so that the insect can be able to land well. And they produce nectar, which can be used to make honey by insects like the bees. Then we also have order of fertilization. After pollination, after the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma, we have fertilization, which is the fusion of the male and the female gametes. Now the order of fertilization that you are going to look at here is, first we start with pollination. Pollination has to take place, so we have pollination as the first one. After pollination, the next is germination of the pollen grains. So germination of the pollen grains germinate, and pollen grains germinate on the stigma. Pollen grains germinate, they germinate on the stigma. Then we have development of the pollen tube. Development of the pollen tube is done on the style. This one is done on the style, get the differences. Then we have fusion. The pollen tube breaks, which leads to fusion of the male and the female gametes. The male gametes in this case are the pollen grains, and the female gametes in this case are the ovules. So we have fusion. Then lastly, we have formation of seeds and fruits. So the seeds are formed from the ovules, and the fruits are formed from the ovary. So that is the order of pollination. We can also look at the diagram of a monocot and a dicot seed. So we have monocot and dicot. So when you look at this first part of the seed, this is an example of a monocot seed. So with a monocot seed, we have the endosperm. We have endosperm, which stores food. We have cotyledon. Cotyledon, the function of cotyledon in a monocot is to nourish the embryo. So we have plumule, and we also have radicle, not forgetting the tester. So radicle grows to become a root, plumule grows to become a shoot. When we look at the bean seed, so we have tester, this is the tester, which protects the inner parts. So this one is the plumule. So again, the difference, radicle can be placed here, look at the diagram, or if we have another extension, the radicle can also be found at this part. So you have to look at the diagram, how it is drawn. So according to my diagram, the radicle is at this part, but some different diagrams, the radicle will be at that part. So we have the cotyledon here. We have the micropyle, which allows air and water into the seed during seed germination. So those are parts of a monocot seed and a dicot seed. And a monocot has one cotyledon and a dicot has two cotyledons. So you can look at the two as we move very fast. Then we also look at seed germination. And here we look at the stages of seed germination. So when you look at seed germination, the first stage is the seed absorbs water and air through the micropyle. So the seed absorbs water and air through the micropyle. After the seed absorbing water and air, so the seed swells. The seed swells and becomes big. After the seed swelling, the tester bursts. After the tester bursting, the radicle comes out first, and a point to note, the radicle comes out through the micropyle. Note that the radicle comes out through the micropyle. Then the last one is plumule comes out. Plumule comes out. So those are the stages of seed germination, and for this germination to occur, we have conditions necessary for seed germination, which is air, water, and warmth. For you to check in practical examples, if air is used during seed germination, you take two containers, one with boiled water covered by a film of oil, another one with water without oil. So where we have oil, the seeds will not germinate due to the absence of air. If you want to check if water is used during germination, you take two containers, one you put wet cotton wool, the other one you put dry cotton wool. Where we have wet cotton wool, the seeds germinate. Where we don't have wet, we have dry, the seeds will not germinate. That shows that water is used during germination. If you want to check if warmth is used during germination, still take two containers, one where we have ice cubes and the other ones we don't have ice cubes. Where we have ice cubes, the seeds will not germinate. Where we don't have ice cubes, the seed will germinate. So these two experiments, why do you put one experiment where it will work and the other one where it will not work? We do that so that one can work as a control experiment. Control experiment means in the absence of a specific thing that you're looking for, the conditions not favoring, then it will not work. So that's why we have to put oil and not oil. Where we don't have oil, for it will germinate. Wet cotton wool and dry cotton wool. Wet will germinate. Ice cubes, no ice cubes. Where we don't have ice cubes, then it will not germinate. So those are the conditions necessary for seed germination. So we can also move very fast to class 7 work. In this part, we look at interdependence, and we can look at interdependence between plants and plants, interdependence between plants and animals, and interdependence between plants, animals and animals also. So those are examples of interdependence that we look at. So interdependence is, as an explanation, is a way through which animals or living things depend on each other. So it is a relationship between living things. So we have plants and animals. So we can have interdependence between animals, and examples of interdependence between animals: we have transport, we have raw materials, we have care, we have food. Interdependence between animals and plants can have food, medicine, sorry, I have to really move very fast, oxygen, we can have fuel, and we can have shade. We can also look at interdependence between plants and plants, and I want to be keen here. You should be keen when you look at interdependence between plants and plants here. So we look at support, we look at habitat, and we look at shade. When you talk about support, plants use what we call tendrils, and tendrils are modified leaves. Tendrils are modified leaves. We talk about shade and not shelter. Shelter is used as a distractor in exams. So we have tendrils, which are modified leaves. We have habitat, where an animal lives, and we have shade. When we talk about habitat, we can talk about saprophytic plants, and these are plants that grow on dead, decaying matter. So examples of saprophytic plants, we have fungi. When we talk about fungi, you can talk about mushroom, we can talk about molds, we can talk about puffballs, we can talk about toadstools. So these are examples of saprophytic plants, which are fungi. So we have toadstools as examples. Then we have parasitic plants. From the word parasite, they depend on others entirely. We have dodder plant, we have broomrape, mistletoe, lichen, and moss. Those are examples of saprophytic plants. Then the last part in this, we look at interdependence between plants and animals now generally. So here we have what you call a food chain, and a food chain shows a feeding relationship. So a food chain usually starts with what we call producers. Producers are usually green plants. Then they are followed by what you call primary consumers. Primary consumers are mainly herbivores. Then they are followed by secondary consumers and tertiary consumers. So you can look at that as a way of revising. And questions come when one is affected, what happens to the others. So you can look at that as an extra work for you. Then we have crop pests, and pests, these are animals that attack the crops. So we have those that attack in the field are called field pests, and those that attack in the store, those are called storage pests. So field pests, we can have examples of field pests, which you can have an aphid, you can have a cutworm, a stalk borer, and also weaver birds. When we look at storage pests, we can have weevils, we can have termites, and rodents. So those are examples of pests that we look at. So we go to our main thing today, which is adaptations of plants to the environment. And under adaptation of plants to the environment, we are going to look at plants that grow in dry areas, plants that grow in wet areas, and plants that grow in average areas, average conditions. So when you look at plants that grow in dry areas, these are plants, we call them xerophytes. Xerophytes are plants that grow in dry areas. We also have plants that grow in wet areas, and they are called hydrophytes. Then we have plants that grow in the normal environment, if I can call it normal, or the average environment, and these are called mesophytes. So we are going to look at adaptations of xerophytes and hydrophytes mainly. And at this point, we are going to look at them as a whole. So one is usually the opposite of the other. For the purposes of knowing and for the purposes of grasping it, you can look at adaptations of one and know them very well at your fingertips. When you're asked about the other, you can be giving the opposite. So you can really get to know the characteristics of xerophytes. So when you're asked about hydrophytes, you give now the opposite of what you know. That's how you learn best, and that's how you make learning easier. So let's look at adaptations of plants to the environment. So I start by defining the environment, and an environment is usually the surrounding of an organism. So how do you define an environment? Environment is the surrounding. Take note of that word, surrounding of an organism. So that makes the environment. Adaptations. We have to define these. What are adaptations? These are mechanisms, one, that enable plants to survive. So these are mechanisms that will enable a plant to survive, and it will survive in different areas. So plants can survive in dry areas. If you go to arid and semi-arid areas, you'll find plants there. We have plants that survive in wet areas. If you go to wet areas around the lakes, in marshy areas, in swamps, you'll still get plants there. Then we also have the average conditions. These average conditions can also be called normal conditions. So those are adaptations. So those are mechanisms. Under that, I said we have three categories. So we have the first category here, which is called mesophytes. And what are mesophytes? Plants that survive in average conditions. Average is the word. So we have examples. You can have maize and beans. We look at hydrophytes from the word hydro. Hydro means water. So examples of plants here, these are plants that can survive in wet areas. We are looking at water lily, buttercup, water hyacinth, and water lettuce. We look at the third category, which are xerophytes. These are plants that survive in dry areas. So dry areas is the word here, wet areas is the word. So examples of xerophytes, we can have cactus as one example. We can have candelabra, we can have aloe vera, and we can have euphorbia. So these plants have characteristics that make them similar to each other. So these are characteristics that enable it to survive in dry areas. Let's look at dry areas. For example, dry areas, there's minimum water. So these characteristics have to be in a way that the plant will be able to maximize on the little water that is available. While it's maximizing on the little water that is available, it should also lose as minimum water as possible. It should not lose much water. When we come to hydrophytes, now it's the opposite. Hydrophytes grow in areas where we have plenty of water. So it does not need that water as such. Therefore, its adaptations must be in a way that it can lose as much water as possible. So that is what you are going to look at. What will make a xerophyte not to lose water and to store water, and what will make a hydrophyte to lose a lot of water and not to conserve water. So we look at the adaptations of xerophytes and hydrophytes. Back at home, you can give some examples of xerophytes that you have not given as I take this glass of water. So xerophytes, these are plants that have deep and extensive root system. Deep and extensive root system. And hydrophytes are plants that have shallow and few roots. Now, I explained that part. The hydrophytes, they have a shallow roots and few because they don't need much absorption of water. One of the functions of roots is to absorb water. Now, xerophytes have a deep and extensive. Deep goes inside, extensive spreads. So they have a deep and extensive root system in order to absorb as much water as possible. In these dry areas, the water table is very low. So the roots have to go as deep as the water table is so that much water can be absorbed. We have another adaptation. Xerophytes have few stomatas or sunken stomatas, while hydrophytes have many stomatas. Stomatas are found on the plant. Most of the time they are found on the leaves, but they can also be found on other parts like the stem. Now when we come to xerophytes, the stomatas are very few to minimize water loss through transpiration. But when you come to hydrophytes, the stomatas are so many so that they can lose much water. And plants lose water through a process called transpiration. And to investigate transpiration, you tie a leaf with a colorless polythene bag and you see droplets of water. That is transpiration. Now, the third point is very key and very confusing and very interesting. So, it is about hairs. All these xerophytes and hydrophytes have what you call hairs. But there is something interesting about these hairs. What is the interesting part? In xerophytes, we have what you call shiny hairs. In hydrophytes, we have what you call waxy hairs. That is the first difference. These are shiny, these are waxy. Those are two different things. Now, these are shiny to reflect away sunlight. Why should they reflect away sunlight? To minimize overheating. Then these ones have a waxy hairs on the upper surface of the leaves. And what is the importance? To prevent water from settling on them. Now, this point is very key. And it's very interesting, as I've said. They both have hairs. Xerophytes are shiny, hydrophytes are waxy. Shiny to reflect away much sunlight to avoid overheating. Overheating will lead to loss of much water. The others are waxy. Why are they waxy? Because they grow in areas where we have too much water. They prevent water from settling on the surface. If they're not waxy, the water will settle on the surface and it will interfere with so much. So they have to be waxy. It is like an oiled thing, an oiled paper. When you pass water on an oiled paper, the water will not stick, it will just flow because of the oil. So that's why they are waxy, and it is for the purposes of preventing water settling on them. Xerophytes have what you call needle-like leaves. Xerophytes have what you call needle-like leaves, which means their leaves have been modified or reduced to thorns or spikes. On the other hand, these have what you call broad leaves. The purpose of needle-like leaves is to minimize the stomatas. A thorn cannot have stomatas as such, so it is to minimize that and to prevent water loss. But when we come to hydrophytes, the leaves are very broad, so that they can have many stomatas, so that much water can be lost. We move on. We have deciduous. Some people call it deciduous. So I'll call it deciduous. What is the meaning of deciduous? These are plants that lose their leaves. These are plants that lose their leaves. They do not lose because they are sick. No, they lose on purpose. Why should they lose their leaves? You can try answering at home. Why do you think they should lose their leaves? 1 second to do that. Now, they should lose their leaves with this reason. They should lose their leaves so that they can prevent transpiration from taking place. Transpiration takes place on the leaves many a times because of the presence of stomatas. So when these leaves are not there, then transpiration will not take place. So water will not be lost. So they are deciduous xerophytes. When you come to hydrophytes, they are all seasons, which means they do not lose their leaves at any time. Xerophytes roll or fold their leaves. They roll or fold their leaves. But when you come to hydrophytes, they don't. They have what you call a succulent stem. Succulent stem. When I mean about succulent stem, I mean stem that is thick. Look, for example, a cactus. Their stem looks something like this. So this is the succulents that I'm talking about. So succulent stem. To store water, that is the purpose of the succulent stem. Whereas in hydrophytes, they have what you call a flexible stem. Succulent stem, flexible stem. They all have stems, of course. Succulent for xerophytes, for the purposes of storing water. And I gave an example of succulent. Nilichora kitu inakaa hivi so that it can store water in them. But these ones have what you call a flexible stem to prevent them from breaking due to the water currents. So we have reversed mechanism of opening and closing of the stomata. Reversed mechanism, but these ones have what you call normal way of opening and closing of the stomata. When I talk about reversed mechanism of opening and closing of the stomata, this is what I mean. Xerophytes open their stomatas during the night. So that is a reversed way. They are supposed to open during the day, but for xerophytes, they open during the night, such that at night you don't have much sunlight. So because you don't have much sunlight, then much water will not be lost, because sunlight brings the aspect of evaporation. and evaporation brings the aspect of loss of water. So they have what you call a reversed mechanism of opening and closing of the stomata, while the hydrophytes have a normal way. The hydrophytes will open the stomatas during the day and they'll close during the night. So xerophytes behave like nocturnal animals. They're active at night, whereas the others are not active at night. So that's the difference. So we can look at some few diagrams. So we have a diagram of the xerophyte and hydrophyte there. So we have that's the first example, or the first diagram that I've drawn there. The first example is a xerophyte. So that is a cactus. Now let's look at these adaptations that I've been talking about. So we have thorns or needle-like leaves. So these ones can be thorns, needle-like leaves. You can call it spikes. So that's an example. They have succulent stem. They have succulent stem. This one is the stem of a cactus. That's a very common question. So they have a succulent stem, and you can look at this other diagram. They're the same. So they have a succulent stem. Some other adaptations we cannot see, like closing and opening of the stomata. We cannot see that. So we have other examples. We have other examples. We have xerophytes. We have an example which can be a baobab tree. And the diagram of a baobab tree is coming. The diagram of a baobab tree is coming. The diagram of a baobab tree is just coming. So those are xerophytes. And those are adaptations of xerophytes. So we have a baobab tree. And the diagram is coming. Wait just shortly. So just a minute, wait. As we wait for the diagrams, we can look at signs of unhealthy crops. We can look at examples of signs of unhealthy crops. Not yet. So signs of unhealthy crops, we have curved leaves, spots and streaks. We have stunted growth. We have stunted growth. Example of a xerophyte there. So that's an example of a xerophyte. So we also have examples of hydrophytes there. So that is an example of a water hyacinth. You can look at the adaptations. So these are floating flowers. These are flexible stems. So we had looked at also signs of unhealthy crops. So these are spots and streaks. This one is also another example of signs of unhealthy crops. So those are examples of unhealthy crops that you have looked at and the diagrams. So that is about plants in class 8, starting from class 1 up to where we have reached. So if you have any questions, you can keep them streaming. And as we answer the questions, we can look at just maybe 2 examples in KCP Science. So I'll start with 2019. I'll only look at 2 questions, 2019. I will read, which one of the following plants is classified as both green and non-flowering? The right answer is supposed to be a moses. So a moses is an example of green and flowering. That is class 5. So let me go to a class 8 question. 2019, number 39. A plant with deep and widespread root system is also likely to have, the right answer is supposed to be thick cuticle. So those are some of the questions that were set in the KCPE. So let me look if I have maybe one or two questions. Let me answer maybe one question before I stop. I have like 1 minute to end. So what? A question. Is sunflower an oil crop? Yes, it's an oil crop. Where does sugarcane fall? Sugarcane is not a tuber. It stores its food in the stem. The last question. Morning Mwalimu, what are some adaptations of hydrophytes? Adaptations of hydrophytes, I talked about broad leaves. I talked about many stomatas. And then the root system is not as deep as in xerophytes. So those are some of the examples or adaptations of hydrophytes. So I end my lesson there. Back